Good evening. Oh, that's a nice mic system. I like that. Everybody can hear in the back? That was yes? Okay, super. Well, I am just tickled pink to see you all here this evening, and I think this is the biggest crowd we've ever had for the Living Endowment Dinner, at least in my memory. So it's just great to have you here, and I want to acknowledge a few people before we get started with our program this evening. And there are a number of individuals who I want to highlight who are instrumental in bringing this evening to fruition. Mark Jansen reached out initially to let us know our Polish colleagues would be coming to South Central Kansas, so we appreciate very much that he let us know about this quite a while ago, at least 6 months, maybe 9 months ago. We learned that we'd be getting some visitors from Poland to this area. And then Rod Ratzlaff and Donna Ratzlaff-Hedrick have been hosting our guests this week and into the weekend and over the weekend. So we're very grateful for all the hosting they've been doing. And then staff members and volunteers who played a key role in preparing for this evening's gathering. And I will say we've had just all kinds of help. You've seen the servers, I don't want to say scurrying around. They were quite professional, I thought. But they were here too. We did have a few people, though, that really have been working for weeks to get things going. And that would be Nathan Bartle. Julie Robinson was coordinating our servers. Lorna Harder helped coordinate the centerpieces. And then we have Coralie Schenk, the ringmaster of all. So she's over on the side there. So thank you very much to those folks for making this evening go very well so far. And our program this evening is a part of a series held in conjunction with the special exhibition Unlocking the Past, Immigrant Artifacts and the Stories They Tell. And we do have a few program schedules out front there by the little vignette near the door if you want to pick up a program schedule. And the next program that we will be having will be Sunday afternoon, November 24 at 3 o'clock back at Kaufman Museum. And that will be Eric Anderson from Haskell Indians Nations University. And his topic will be Diversity and Complexity in Indian Kansas. So that's November 24 at the museum. This evening, Dr. Mark Jansen, professor of history at Bethel College, will introduce our speaker. Mark has lived and worked extensively in Europe and currently serves on the Kaufman Museum Board of Directors. He's led over a dozen college or public trips to the Vistula Valley in northern Poland, and he's often done that while collaborating with John Thiessen, director of the Mennonite Library and Archives at Bethel College. Our speaker today, Michał Targowski, has often hosted Mark's groups when Americans visited Poland. And so this evening, the tables have turned, and Mark has the honor of introducing Michał today.
I am delighted to introduce tonight's Living Endowment Dinner speaker, Dr. Michał Targowski. How's that? Is that better? Okay. I am delighted to introduce tonight's Living Endowment Dinner speaker, Dr. Michał Targowski. He's a researcher and assistant professor of the history department at Nicolaus Copernicus University in Toruń, Poland. He comes to Mennonite history through an interest particularly in local history and the question of what ties do particular people build over time to specific places, an approach to history that fits perfectly with Kaufman Museum's permanent exhibit theme of land and people. He has scores of publications in a wide variety of formats intended for audiences that range from academic to popular. and he focuses on many aspects of regional history, which for Toruń and the Vistula River Valley includes, of course, a lot of writing on Mennonite history, most prominently a monograph on Mennonites in the area of Toruń during the early modern period. We first met in 2018 at the conjunction of two new endeavors. The first Mennonite Experience in Poland tour that John Thiessen and I led, and the recent opening of a new branch of the Toruń Ethnographic Museum. This new open-air museum across the Vistula River from Toruń is located adjacent to the cemetery of the former Obernassau or Wielka Niszawska Mennonite Church. It is dedicated to the preservation and presentation of the material culture of Mennonites and other Dutch settlers along the lower Vistula River. With his knowledge of Mennonite history, Dr. Targowski has helped us to build important connections to this museum. If you'd like to visit there yourself, please come talk to John or I afterwards, because we're going there again in June. And I see some people in the room who have been there as well. Now, 40 miles northwest of Obernassau, near the town of Schwecha, is the former Mennonite congregation of Przechówko, the mother church of Alexanderville and Hoffnungsau congregations. Rod Ratzliff was on our 2019 tour and has since then assisted local efforts to restore this important cemetery, which had been completely overgrown and forgotten to the point that when we went looking for it in 2019, we couldn't even find it. Rod has made additional connections to the nearby Lower Vistula Landscape Parks complex, which has a former Mennonite-style house on its grounds. As one result of Rod's efforts, Dr. Targowski and two staff from that landscape park are visiting the Mennonite communities of South Central Kansas this week. And we are taking advantage of their presence among us to hear Dr. Targowski this evening. For those of us who have followed the 500-year history of Mennonites in Poland over the last few decades, the renewed interest among local Poles in our story has been an amazing development that evokes tremendous gratitude. Our journey together along the banks of the Vistula over the centuries have been filled with both light and darkness, with the terror of World War II and then communist rule casting shadows that obscured these connections for half a century. Working together now on our history is a welcome reminder of the bright times of refuge and welcome in that story, a wonder and a blessing. Please join me now in welcoming Dr. Michał Targowski as he speaks on the first new homeland, Mennonite migrations to and from Poland, Prussia in the 16th to 18th centuries.
Let me first thank Mark for this wonderful introduction. I am really honored to be here. It's a great pleasure to be hosted by Rod Ratzlaff and Donna Hedrick-Ratzlaff, but also by all people who we meet here during this very short and busy week. We are all together with my friends really in love with this area, with people whose names we can read in our area only on some old gravestones, or I can read in old archives and libraries, finding some old papers from 18th or 19th century. There are so many Funks, Ewerts, Bartels, Friesens, Classens. I think I can recall many of these names from the papers, and now is the first time I have a chance to meet people whose roots are there when Mennonites are no longer there. Because that's the worst thing in the whole story, that to meet Mennonite people, I have to go so far. But I am really glad to meet all of you. I am really glad that we bring this story of Mennonite presence in Poland back to people both in Poland and in the United States, but also in Germany and the Netherlands, because you know well that the Mennonite community is a global community. And so thank you very much for a chance to give this short speech about a very important place, I think, in the Mennonite history, which is Royal Prussia, or called also Polish Prussia. It's a rather small territory in northern Poland on Baltic Sea, situated along Vistula River, the longest of all rivers that flow into Baltic Sea, the biggest of all of them and very important for trade and for trade merchanting in the 16th, 18th century. So the area, the time that I'm going to focus on. Just to show where it is, some of you have been in this area where the biggest city, Gdańsk, Danzig, was very important for both German people, Polish people, Mennonites, Catholics, Lutherans. It was a commercial hub for this part of Europe, the biggest port ever in Baltic Sea, and a very important hub to transport goods like grain from Poland to the West, but also to transfer ideas, contacts, and to move people from one place to another. I recommend a visit to Gdańsk and all these territories. These are wonderful places, full of historical buildings and full of this atmosphere that Mennonites who lived there could also feel. Let me begin with the first Great Migration. Right now we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Great Migration from Russia, Ukraine and Prussia here to America and to Kansas as well. And let me come back to this earliest time in Anabaptist history, to the 16th century, when Mennonites were trying to find a place for themselves, were trying to find a safe haven somewhere in Europe. You know well the story that was depicted in the Martyr's Mirror about persecution of Mennonites who were not accepted by Western rulers because of their radical beliefs. But that was not the only push factor, a factor that pushed them to seek out different areas where they could settle. Another push factor was economic challenges in times of war and urbanization. We have to remember that the 16th century is a time of religious wars, especially in the Netherlands and on the French-German borderland, and that makes many people leave their houses, their farms, trying to find a place where they could live in peace. But it's also economics, so just the fact that urbanizing areas become too densely populated for the people who want to have farms. Around Dutch cities that developed fast in the 16th century, the prices of land become higher and higher. Many farmers are not able to live there because their income is too low. So there are also economic factors that would lead Mennonites, Anabaptists from the Netherlands to the new homeland. But why do they choose Poland and Polish Prussia? There are some pull factors that we can find. We Polish people are proud to say that Poland was a country, a state of religious tolerance. That was something extraordinary in this Europe where all rulers, almost all, were in constant war because of religions in the 16th century. Poland seemed a peaceful country where no one was persecuted because of his beliefs. But it was rather an indifference in religious matters from a side of Polish noblemen, the proud men who in fact ruled in this country. Poland was more a republic than a monarchy. We had a king, but the king was elected, and each nobleman felt a king in his property, in his landed estate. So, in fact, the good thing that resulted from that for Mennonites was that it was quite easy to get in touch with the noblemen and have a contract with them, had a kind of promise from their side, because the nobleman was more important than the king. These were noblemen or even bishops who were of noble origins who guaranteed Mennonites a peaceful living in this area. Polish Prussia was also a place that was tied to the Netherlands. It was a natural direction. It was the way the crops would be taken from Poland via Gdańsk to the Netherlands. Also lumber, Dutch ships were built with Polish lumber. So ships went this way to bring goods, and they would come back with people, but also with Dutch brick, with some luxury products. These ties were so close that almost all famous artists who lived in Gdańsk in that time were of Dutch origin. And this influence can be seen in architecture in Gdańsk, also in paintings. You can see a very famous painting showing prosperity of this town, of Danzig, Gdańsk, in the 16th century. It was painted by Dutch painters, Wilhelm and Abraham van den Bock, and some people say they were Mennonites, although it's hard to prove, but those who like Mennonite history, they believe it. And you can see there a kind of rainbow arch and a triumphal arch. Above there is a big city, it's Gdańsk, and there God's hand that protects the city, that blesses the city. Down there we can see tradesmen, noblemen, people gathering in front of the important artist hall, the commercial center of Gdańsk. But what is around the triumphal arch is Vistula River. This vein that led cargo boats filled with grain, lumber, towards north, towards Gdańsk, where these goods were shipped to the Netherlands. Poland was known as Europe's granary at that time. Our name of our country, Poland, is derived from pole, which means a field. A good field to plow and to have good wheat there. So we were very important grain exporters, grain producers. So we were also a very good place for skilled farmers. And the Dutch farmers were the best of their times in Europe in the 16th century. Another thing that was needed in Poland, that what made many Mennonites come there, was a need for settlers, for labor, for people who can work. We had plenty of empty territories, wide spaces of inhabited land. We had many landlords, but we had only few people who could work for them. And there was also a huge need for payments and taxes that would be taken from the settlers and would be spent on luxury goods that were sold in Gdańsk and driven there from different countries in the world. I would like to address a few things that Mennonites brought to Poland, because wherever you migrate somewhere, you bring something, but also the place where that becomes your homeland, your new homeland, it also changes you. And in fact, it happened that way that Mennonites brought new things to Polish Prussia, to Polish lands, things that were adapted and things that were really modern and needed and of great importance. These were especially new solutions in farming and food production. You can see in the picture the lady that's holding two pieces of yellow cheese, hard cheese. That was something that Polish farmers were not able to do. The secret of yellow cheese production was kept by the Dutch. They brought it with themselves. And you surely know why the yellow cheese is better than what do you call it, quark? This, how would you call the fresh cottage cheese? What? Cottage cheese, that's it. You know that cottage cheese spoils in a few days. Yellow cheese can stay fresh much longer. You cannot send the fresh cheese from Toruń to sell it in Gdańsk because it spoils on its way. But you can have yellow cheese well prepared and sell it wherever you want because it stays good for a long time. So you can have more money from your production. That was very important. That was something new. Polish farmers were unable at that time to sell their products on market. They could barely live themselves on what they produced. So their production was very small. They usually had not more than one cow, some chickens. So this was a very poor farming. While the Dutch, they needed quite many cows, I would say 8-10 cows in their long, big house barn. And that's how they were able to have big amounts of milk and then produce yellow cheese that was expensive. So that was something new. The new thing was, in fact, cattle breeding. I just mentioned, Polish farmer would have one cow or one bull to pull a plow, while Dutch people would focus on cattle breeding. That may be quite different than your Mennonite farmers had, because in the 19th century when they came, they were rather grain producers. But the history of the Mennonites in Poland is a history of people who were experts in cattle breeding. They also possessed large territories situated in the valley of Vistula River. This area was quite often flooded, but there were many meadows, many pastures. The grass was very good. That was an advantage. That's what they would use to produce this wonderful cheese and wonderful butter. As historian, I work with sources. I have found many letters written by Polish noblemen to these Dutch Mennonite farmers, in which nobleman writes, "Please send me this good yellow cheese." They even paid tax in butter and cheese. That was better than money, I would say. So the other thing was, if they lived in the deep valley of Vistula River, Vistula that has its springs in high mountains in Poland, the snowy mountains, because we've got a lot of snow in winter, a lot of rain in summer. The Vistula can rise high above its regular level and make us many troubles, including dangerous floods. Also ice that is blocked in the river in springtime when ice melts, but unfortunately not in northern Poland. Then the ice formed high dams, and the dams would cause very dangerous floods. That was really hard to live there. However, these Dutch people knew how to do this because they came from lowlands in the Netherlands. They had know-how in water management system. They knew maybe not how to bring water here. That was not the thing they wanted. They knew how to dry fields, how to dry meadows, how to let water leave the field when the winter was over, when snow melted. They were expert in this drainage system, but also in building dikes, ditches, everything. It served so well, and they knew it so well that when they were gone, when they left Poland, for example, the last ones in 1945, Polish people did not know how to keep this drainage system. It did not work. There was a problem to make these fields dry again. It lasted years before our people learned how to work with water in this territory. But that was something important that Mennonite farmers especially, would bring to our country. There was also something new in settlements they would build. In this wet valley of Vistula River, they would find a dry piece of land, usually about a hill, a long hill or long range of the river valley where they would build their houses. It was absolutely different to typical Polish villages which were built in the 13th, 14th century. These houses were built in a row, in a long row lasting for few miles even. The longest villages in Vistula Valley are 3 miles long. So that's really impressive for us, because other Polish villages were places where people lived together in small distance. All farms were nearby, garden to garden. The new Dutch settlement, Mennonite settlement, meant something absolutely different. And also these farmers were individual farmers. Polish farmers would, at that time, work always together. They were forced to live together, to work together, and half of their time, or even more, they had to work for their landlord, for noblemen. That was something the Mennonites were absolutely free of. Okay? There was no need to work for a nobleman because they were free people. But they needed to keep themselves together. They needed to organize help for themselves, because if something like flood or fire happened, they were left alone. Nobody would help them. And that's how Mennonites would invent many new ways of living together, of communal solidarity. But they also brought from the Netherlands something special that was unknown in Poland. It was self-government. The villages that were inhabited by Mennonites and other Dutch or German settlers, they would elect a mayor each year. It's much more often than today. Today we elect in Poland village mayor once for 5 years. They elected one for each year, and 2 other guys, Beisitzer, to control the mayor. And the mayor has a lot to do because he was responsible for the order in the village, but also he was a judge in some cases, and he was responsible for gathering all taxes, payments, and giving it to the nobleman or to the bishop. Something extraordinary brought by the Mennonites to Poland was the Dutch architecture, Dutch farmhouses. One of these houses you can see in the picture. I've got 2 pictures, both from Obernassau, so the former Mennonite village near Toruń, where I work at the university. And this house was surely built in the 18th century, built and inhabited by the Mennonite settlers. It was so-called house barn that had under one roof rooms where people lived, but also cattle, and then a barn all together, because it was very useful when the flood came and water was all around. Then they did not have to leave house to milk cows, to work with animals, and the most important thing, they would build such houses on terps, on special hills. These were man-made hills that protected them from floods. Here is an example of Mennonite house, another Mennonite house in Obernassau. You can see how long it is. And if you look carefully, you will find there are also people in front of the house standing with horses, because that's their pride. Look what we have, cattle, horses, that's important. And I have also one picture showing typical Mennonite village. Chrystkowo, that's where my friends work, where we've got the old-type Mennonite house built in the 18th century, preserved in situ. And you can see the black dots, which are houses and how close to the river they are, not protected by any dike. So flooded at least once a year, but still a good place for living, because the soil was good and they could have good crops and good grass for their animals. That is what Mennonites changed here in this area. Colonized the Vistula River, introduced new solutions, new ways of living, of production, but the new homeland also changed them. You surely know that these Dutch people, Mennonites who came from the Netherlands, they used and poured Dutch and part a language that was similar to Low German or was a Low German. They were from many different towns and villages, not only in what we would call the Netherlands today, but also they would come from Belgium, from North German countries. They spoke many different dialects. And what happened when they lived in Poland is that they accepted new migrants. It's hard to believe because, Mennonites, or at least those former generations, are people who would not like any newcomers. That was something that they preferred to be in their own group. And I'm just saying it was absolutely different. Believe me that Mennonites in Polish Prussia, they did not live in Mennonite colonies, but they always lived in a village where there were also people of different denominations, not Catholics, but rather Lutheran people. And we know from Przechowka church book that there were many Lutheran people who were accepted and became Mennonites because there was something in this religion that brought other people to them. One of these people was Rod Racław's ancestor. He was a soldier, a Swedish soldier, but of Pomeranian origin, so from the area between Poland and Germany. And in the 17th century, in times of war, he decided to throw away his gun into a bush and join Mennonites. And it was not an easy task because it was not allowed for Mennonites in Poland to accept converts. They would be punished with confiscation of all their properties, or they would be expelled. What did Racław have to do? He had to go to Amsterdam to get baptized there, so he joined them as a Mennonite when he came back. Okay, so it was a choice. It meant something to become Mennonite, and believe me but that also led to Germanization. Many of these newcomers were of German origin, especially in my area, so upstream Vistula, close to Toruń, Graudenz, Montau, where you've got Przechowka congregation, Montau, or Szynze, the names you may know. People who lived there had very often this Lutheran origin, and they joined Mennonites. That's why their names are not Dutch. You can recognize that names like Klassen, Dirksen, they are of Dutch origin. But the names like Funk, or you would say Fank, probably Fank, or let's have Ewart, Kerber, these are not Dutch names. These were people who joined Mennonites, probably, in the 16th, 17th century, right there in Poland on Vistula River. But that resulted in Germanization. Slowly, the German language became more important than the Dutch. And even if there were Dutch speakers, they would turn to German. You know probably well that even in the 18th century, there were Dutch Bibles in their houses. And Dutch was the language of preaching in churches until 18th century. But it became that no one could understand it anymore because they all used German, Low German. That was the thing that happened in Poland, that the Mennonites began to use this Low German, the thing that your ancestors did here, even in the States. And they also accepted material culture. So there were big influences in furniture, in architecture, and living conditions. That was something that influenced Mennonites, especially that they had the big city of Gdańsk, a commercial center. They had an easy access to tobacco, to alcohols. They would not avoid it. Okay, so that also may seem strange, but we know well that Mennonites were quite worldly at that time. They became more radical in later period. And this later period, so let's say late 18th century, is a time in Royal Prussia of big impact of pietism, a religious idea, philosophical religious idea that told people to become modest, simple, to avoid luxury, to stay calm in different situations, to concentrate on prayers, to be more evangelical. That is something that fits Mennonites today, I think, or at least fitted a few decades before. But that is also something that we can trace back in rural Prussia, and it's very, very probable that the atmosphere of pietism grew there in the 18th century. There were some other changes in the Mennonite way of living. I have just referred to some of them. I told you that Poland was so a good country, religious freedom and no problems with religion. But in fact, with time, in the late 17th century, after many wars with Lutheran countries, the counter-Reformation atmosphere grew strong in Poland. Polish people would say, then we are Catholics, we do not like different other confessions, and Mennonites or Anabaptists are one of the worst because they are out of control, because they are similar to some sects that have already been banned in Poland, and that resulted in this law that prohibited conversions to Mennonitism. And that's what became a bad experience for Mennonites, because when they accepted somebody, especially in the 18th century, when they accepted a Lutheran or a Catholic, please do not do this. When they accepted someone who converted, then they were banned, expelled, or their goods were gone and taken by a bishop. So I think that was the moment when they began to think we should live alone, separated from the other confessions. So far, they would live in mixed villages among Catholics and Lutherans. They quite often have Lutheran or Catholic maids, boys, servants, and suddenly it becomes a problem because the bishop says, you feed these Catholic maids with meat on Friday. It's forbidden. So you will be punished. And believe me, there are records that confirm such situation. And whenever it happened, it was a great problem for Mennonites. When they migrated, they came back with some people who changed their religion and joined them. They were persecuted for them. So the result is, let's stay in our own group. It's better not to be open. And what is the most important change, I think, is that those Mennonites, maybe not the most, but one of very important things, is that Mennonites became farmers there in Prussia. When they came to Prussia in the 16th century, big number of them were urban people. Some craftsmen, some lesser makers, they wanted to live in Gdańsk and produce good things that could be sold on market. But Lutheran city of Gdańsk did not want it. The guilds were very jealous for their income, and they forbade Mennonites to join guilds and so have the right to work there. And that's why Mennonites would turn to farming, to rural living, because that was a place where nobody would bother about it. People were not jealous. And there was also one thing, one profession that they could choose. It was alcohol distilling. So they were distillers. It's also very hard to believe that, but very famous distilling houses in Gdańsk, in northern Poland, they were owned and run by Mennonites. The time has changed. Some 2 centuries have passed since Mennonites came to Royal Prussia. This land became a kind of strange place, not good for them. It was no longer a safe place for living, and this growing intolerance became one of factors that pushed them out. And another factors were catastrophic wars. It's really hard to believe, especially here in the United States, that during 100 years you can have 10 wars, including many, many years, let's say dozens years of famine, plagues, higher taxes, problems with living, and soldiers moving from place to place. The way the army was organized those days caused that Mennonites had to feed soldiers or accommodate them in their own houses. And it was a very big economical problem because with a war that lasted for a few years, they could last everything. Cows, food, supplies, everything was gone. That was a very important thing that they decided to move. And so economic challenges that were quite often a result of war was also a problem, and a fear of military service. This fear became important only after so-called partitions of Poland. It was 1772 when German Kingdom of Prussia seized these territories that I'm describing, so Royal Prussia, and then Mennonites were forced, maybe not yet to join the army, but at least to pay higher taxes because of this exemption from military service, and rights to buy new land were limited for Mennonites, so new problems appeared, and that was also another push factor. But during the 18th century especially, Mennonites became more and more known for their farming, and they became model farmers. That happened that way that monarchs in Western Europe, kings of German kingdoms and dukes, German dukes, electors, but also King of France, they all believed that minorities are better in farming, are better craftsmen. That's what made Mennonites welcomed citizens. And it was the Kingdom of Prussia, what's hard to believe, so the very, very militaristic state that invited Mennonites from Vistula to settle, and its part in Neman River. Today it's a border between Kaliningrad Oblast and Lithuania, and it was a German territory at the time, and King of Prussia invited Mennonites to settle down there because he knew they were good farmers and they can also give good example to people who live nearby. And so Mennonites were seen as good example, especially as good farmers and cattle breeders. And there was also a big need for new colonies in many countries in Europe, especially that these many wars and many plagues, including the beginning of the 18th century, they caused big losses in population, and there was a lot of free spaces to colonize. And you would usually think that these big migrations happened beginning with the Great Migration to Russia. So I hope to surprise you that there were many migrations before. The first one, 1713, that was joined by many Mennonites from Szynce congregation and Przechowko congregation. That was a group that that had the easiest way to migrate or the biggest need to escape. So they chose this Lithuanian-Prussian direction. They welcomed the invitation of King of Prussia to settle in Prussian Lithuania. It was 1713, the middle of the Great Northern War, the moment when they were really, really poor people because of this constant wars, feeding soldiers, and also the war with Lithuania and Sweden in Poland was seen as a war between Catholicism and Lutheranism and our Protestant confession, including Mennonites. So that's how Mennonites became less and less tolerated. They were not allowed to have churches, to build churches, or to teach religion at their schools. Schools were being closed. So it was a dramatic moment, and that's a moment when many Mennonite families left Vistula area and settled in Prussia and Lithuania. Unfortunately, that was not a story that has a good end, or maybe has a good end. But first, after a few years of their stay in Prussia and Lithuania, when the king decided to enroll tall Mennonite boys to his guard. Then all Mennonites left on their own and later were expelled from this territory. So this was a short story, but they had a big trouble what to do with themselves. Some of them came back to Prussia and had to pay a lot to local bishops, noblemen, to get the right to settle down there. They settled at that moment Rudnerweide, Trachheimerweide congregations, so this may also be places or communities you know. And in 1760s, it was a moment, the last years of time when Protestants had no rights at all in Poland. This was a moment when Mennonites from Czechowka and Szanze congregations, they tried to seek their luck again in the kingdom of Prussia, but in its different part. They found men from Brenkenhof who seemed valuable men and was interested in their farming skills. And he thought they would be good drainers of the land situated on one of rivers in Brandenburg, Prussia. So we can see the black arrow lit there when these people settled on Notech and Warta River. And these colonies lasted until beginning of the 19th century. And in fact, they were Mennonite colonies. So these are the moments when Mennonite decides to migrate in their own group because they would feel much better. In the 1760s, they would go following this green road to Mazovia, which was part of central Poland. And it was again because of these expectations from noblemen's side that they would be good farmers, they would settle the land that stayed untouched since times of great wars in the beginning of the 18th century. That's the moment when Deutsche Kreis and Wymyśle congregations are founded. These are congregations that lasted until 1945, but some of their members moved here to America in 1870s. And finally, there is the most known destination. So 1789 marks the beginning of the great migration to New Russia, to Ukraine, to Hortica, and no wonder that these people join it. They are also invited as these well-known, skilled farmers, but they are also tired with living in Poland that once used to be a good place for living and now is no longer one. There was a lot of political changes in it. There was a lot of instability. So no wonder that so many families chose this way. And these migrants from Prussia to Russia, I think they were quite different to those who migrated in the 16th century. And I hope that we can find in my story that they became these rural farmers, well-organized in groups that were responsible for each other, that had to cooperate despite social differences within, because they were not all farmers. There were also some poor people, but they knew they have to keep together to protect themselves. They were now all Low German speakers, although in the 16th century, many of them spoke different languages, and also, so this is a result of staying for so long. These were almost 300 years that they stayed in Poland, in Polish Prussia, and the result is not that they accepted Polish language, but Low German. And what comes is also High German in liturgy, because it was High German that replaced Dutch in liturgy. So their books, their official prayers were in High German, and it was also something that changed in Royal Prussia. For sure, they were afraid of mixing with other groups. I think that not only other groups, other confessions, but also other congregations, probably. Seeking strong rulers, Poland seemed so unstable in its history that for sure Tsar or Tsarin, Catherine, seemed salvation for these people who had to care for each change on Polish throne, because if one king gave you a privilege, and that's what was happened, a king gave privilege to Mennonites and guaranteed them freedom of their confession. But when he died, a new king was elected, and Mennonites had to apply for a new document. Again, pay a lot for that. And each of Polish kings confirmed that old privilege and received huge amount of money and goods from Mennonites, or sent his soldiers to gain money without privilege. So for sure Mennonites were tired with this complicated political system in Poland. And that's why they could like Tsar, Tsarina, they seemed much better. They became radical believers, surely more radical than they had been in the beginning of their stay in Polish Prussia. It's partly because of pietism. And also, if you migrate to save your identity, or if you migrate because of your identity, that's how you became stable in that. But that's how you became more and more radical. And for sure, if you migrate once, you are able to repeat it quite soon. It was only 80 years that many of these families spent in Russia. In 1874, big part of them would again take ship, this time a ship to America. And now you are a part of that history. You are here, and I hope that some things that I recalled here are somewhere deep in yourself. So thank you for your attention. I did not want to take too long, but I am ready to serve you to answer any questions you have, or any questions I am able to respond to answer. Thank you very much. So I'm going to stand here, and if there are any questions, I would gladly try to answer.
Any questions? We have a mic on this side and a mic on that side.
We've got a question.
Thank you very much for this lecture. I'm Elwood Yoder. Did I hear you correctly saying that over time, the Mennonites became more and more known as farmers? Were they in trades and other businesses earlier in 16th and 17th centuries, and then for a variety of reasons becoming more and more farmers in the 18th century? Did I hear you correctly?
Yeah, that's what I mean. They even had no choice because they were not accepted in guilds, and guilds were very jealous. And even we say that Mennonites lived in Gdańsk, but in fact they were not allowed to cross to settle within the city city borders, within city walls. So they had no chance for full citizenship, which guaranteed free professions, access to professions, to markets. So that's why living in suburbs, they could do only, I would say, some produce fabrics at their homes, in their small workshops, or become distillers, because this profession of distiller was not controlled by guilds. That's the reason why they became distillers. When they came here in the 16th century and they settled around Gdańsk, many of them were lace makers, because that's what they would do in Belgium or the Netherlands before they came. And they also had to forget about it. With time, in the 18th century, you have no longer any lace makers among them, because, again, guilds from Gdańsk, they wanted this profession to be included in their pot. So, you know what, the Mennonites did not want to swear, and that is also why they were not accepted in guilds, and also they did not gain citizenship, because what you had to do was to swear. And that was also a problem, to swear, and also if you lived in a city, you had to take arms when city was invaded. And that was also something they would not agree to do. So that's why they were not welcome in Gdańsk. They had to live in the suburbs, especially the suburbs that belonged to other jurisdictions, like noble or even Catholic bishops, areas, accepted Mennonites, with bigger acceptance than the Lutheran city of Gdańsk. So that's why many of them, those who became farmers, they could live longer in peace. They produced good cheese, they made money, and these noblemen, there were many noblemen who would say, we are very Catholic people and we can die for our confession. But there were times when they or even Catholic bishop would stand for Mennonites because they were so good farmers that gave very good income, and they knew that no one else is able to work that way on these wetlands. So we know have some relations from diaries of local parliament that governed, where some radical noblemen attacked a bishop and a Catholic bishop and told him, you tell us about Catholicism as a ruling confession while you are keeping Mennonites in your possessions. Oh, I need them because they are the only ones who can work in this wetland. So that was something that was acceptable, unfortunately, only until the 18th century. Then suddenly people became Catholic people in Poland. Noblemen became more and more radical, and there were situations where they would send Mennonites away, the same with bishops. Even though there were contracts signed for 30, 40 years that Mennonites had the right to use the land and stay there, that was something regular for them. Bishops would say, oh, I'm sorry, this contract is no longer valid. And the next one can be signed only with people who are not Mennonites. And that's how some Mennonite villages disappeared and the people who lived there were forced to leave. But still, in the late 18th century, biggest group of Mennonite people in Vistula Delta and Vistula River Valley, they were farmers or small farmers or sometimes poor people who lived by farmer's house and helped him in this industry or just were fabric producers on a small scale. So these were rather rural activities.
Could you explain a little more what you mean by radical believers?
Radical beliefs. You know, it depends always on what place you're standing, okay? So for these people in our part of the world, in Poland, a radical belief was especially Anabaptism itself as the way of thinking that only adults should become real Christians. You have to be sure that you want to become a Christian, so the adult baptism is something that was absolutely unacceptable for Catholics at that time. It was also not accepted by Lutherans. And it was also because Catholics believe in hell, okay? I hope you do not believe in hell. But Catholics do, and it meant that if you do not baptize your child, his soul would go to hell. And that it's not only, it was an ethic problem for some of Catholic leaders and theologians that Anabaptists are wrong and they are sinners because they make their children suffer forever in hell. Okay? Try to understand. So that was something that they would call radical for sure. It's because of their own theology, yes? But that's what Catholics believe. People who are not baptized, they would dwell forever in hell because their sin was not washed away by baptism, okay? So, and these were kids who grew up 10, 14, 11 years old without baptized. As you know well that half of them died before that time, those years. So that was one of most radical things that Catholics and Lutherans, that seemed that thing seemed most radical for Catholics and Lutherans. The other thing might be the neglection of the whole church hierarchy. Okay, that is typical for Catholic Church, and it's also in Lutheran Church. Okay, and here we've got Anabaptists who have leaders elected among themselves, preachers, elders, or just people who are one of them. There is no hierarchy, there is no control. They are out of control. That was a very big problem. That was radical, okay? And you can find from that story that Anabaptists must have been seen as, I would say, democratic people, as Republican people, to elect a preacher from one of them, not prepared theologically, just a person who is co-believer, a member of society. That was something strange for them. So that was also against some basic rules of this socially differentiated world in which they lived. So that also might have been very attractive for peasants and low-class people to join Mennonites. They must have felt better in this society. So from the beginning, Anabaptists were seen also as, I would say, a revolutionary force. That was a danger to this Catholic hierarchy, to some things that were set in history since many centuries. So I think this thing seemed most radical to these people. Okay.
I'm interested in knowing whether Mennonite families were larger than the families because they were rural, and in a rural setting, children can have put to work sooner than urban families, which were smaller and had fewer opportunities? Because that would have some implication over years that Mennonites were growing faster demographically than their neighboring areas.
No, it depends. First, we do not have many sources that would tell anything about Mennonite families before the 19th century. But I had an occasion to work on some sources for Obernesso congregation, or Obernesso Mennonites and German people who lived there. And you could see that what was bigger, it was the number of births. Okay? It was the 19th century that children began to survive. The question is, it seems like in Mennonite families, Mennonite families seemed bigger because quite often the marriages, second marriages after becoming widower, were more popular in the 19th century among Mennonites in Prussia because of the complicated legal system in which they were not allowed to buy land that did not belong to Mennonites. It was good if you became a widower to have a new wife, to combine two priorities together, two land estates, okay? That was a part of economical thinking, and that these families were quite often bigger because these widowers had the children from the first marriage, from the second marriage, and sometimes each of persons in this marriage was a widower for the second time and had children from different marriages. So that was something that resulted in very big families and that everyone was related to everyone, which you surely know. But it also depended, it's just historical demography that number of births in all rural families was very big until 19th century. And however, we can trace back to the 18th century to see the lists of villagers in Obernesso, and you can find that the families that owned big farms seemed bigger because they needed labor force and children could help a lot, while the families that did not own a land, but they were rather fabric producers, which meant that he had a small workshop and he lived at another farmer's house and was rather a poor man. Then he would live single or with one kid or with two kids. So, but it does not mean that the number of births was smaller, but that they had to send children away sooner, and they were not able to live with them. I tried to count it, but it looked like the regular Mennonite farm in the 18th century needed 10 people. Whether it was a family or servants, mates, employed to work there, it must have been 10 people, because they had so many animals, big fields to do, no machines. That's how the number of people in a household must have been big. But there were people who had to employ. If you did not have children, you had to employ workers. So, but what you're saying, in fact, in the late 19th century, Mennonite families seemed bigger. And people would say, we know many pictures of these families, where 13 people are standing. And it's really hard to say why these families, in fact, stopped procreation a little bit a little bit later than Germans did, than Lutherans did. Because what happens in the 19th century is that people try to regulate births because too many children survive. In the 18th century economy, you would have from 8 born children, only 4 that would survive to the moment they can have their own children. So half of the children dies before 1820s. So that's a poor thing, but that's good from economical point of view. In the 19th century, when you have 10 children and 10 survive, and you have to give land to everyone, that became a huge problem, not only among Mennonites. That's a question.
We'll take one more back there.
I've always wondered, how did the Mennonite farmers in Prussia market their grain? Did they grow more than they could use, and did they take it to Gdansk, or where did they take it? How did they make money?
Okay, you know, we can compare this Royal Prussia to Netherlands, and there is also one similarity I did not address. These were, those days, the most urbanized areas in Europe. So the density of urban settlements, towns, big city of Gdańsk, and smaller towns, each 10 miles you had town in Royal Prussia. So it was very easy to find a market for products, dairy products, or grain products, because urban people did not grow it, did not produce food. So that's how the market was closed. But the prices in Gdańsk were much higher. And even in the 16th century, we know documents that guaranteed Mennonites the right to export their goods, that grain, especially grain, to Gdańsk, using crafts that were on Vistula River. Okay, Vistula was the best highway in Poland, or the only one highway of those days, the main trade road, and it's not an accident that that all the Mennonite villages were built along Vistula River. It was not only the soil and the grassland and meadows, but it was also an access to this best trade road in Poland. And if they would send the cheese, they would sell the cheese to Flisaks, to people who were who would transfer these goods to Gdańsk and sell it there in the market. And that was very common in the 17th and 18th century as well. So Gdańsk was a huge market, and it needed a lot of food. Some of this grain was exported to the Netherlands, and prices were really high. So even prices for cattle. So that's how they could make money, just to sell it, but not to their neighbors, but to their townspeople. Thank you very much.
Well, Michael, we appreciate very much you spending the evening with us and sharing some of this history that to me was very new, the time prior to Prussia and in Polish Prussia. So thank you so much for that. And thank you all for coming, and safe travels as you go home, and we hope you can join us again at some of our programs at the museum. Have a good evening.